The cradle of naval aviation had been baptized. Pensacola's Naval and Marine Corps aviators soon began flying their awe-inspiring flying machines everywhere around the local area, to the thrill and delight of the Pensacolians, who now had a ringside seat to aeronautical displays enjoyed by very few people in the world. This first flight was a training flight, and with two exceptions, Pensacola was, and remains to this day, a training base. Yet all of the great air battles in naval aviation history would be fought by Pensacola-trained aviators. The strength of the flight program in Pensacola has always been the instructors returning from combat operations to share their experiences with young flight students. But flying is not without its dangers. It is terribly unforgiving of any carelessness, incapacity, or neglect. The joy of the first flight was soon spoiled, however, a few days later. Lieutenant Junior Grade James Murray, flying the D-1 Burgess flying boat over Pensacola Bay, stalled, dived, and crashed to his death from an altitude of 200 feet. This was the first aviation fatality in the history of the state of Florida and the second naval aviator to die in naval aviation's brief history. Despite this tragedy, the aviators continued their training. This March 1914 photograph shows the aviators present at Pensacola: Lieutenant Herbster, Lieutenant McIlvaine, Lieutenant Bellinger, Lieutenant Softly, Lieutenant Towers, Lieutenant Commander Mustin, Lieutenant Smith, Ensign Chevalier, and Ensign Stoltz. The opening of the Naval Air Station also introduced the dashing young naval aviator into Pensacola society. One local writer noted that the flyer's combination of charm, adventure, handsome uniform, and financial security proved irresistible to many young ladies. Within 15 years of naval aviation's arrival, it was estimated that more than 100 women were married to Navy or Marine Corps officers, earning Pensacola the nickname Mother-in-Law of the Navy. In fact, a 1931 newspaper article listed every woman by name. Barely settled in Pensacola, however, the first bugle call to action for Pensacola's naval aviators occurred in support of combat operations in Veracruz, Mexico. On April 20th, 1914, an aviation detachment embarked aboard the USS Birmingham with two Curtiss flying boats and a hydro airplane. A second detachment was also formed and embarked aboard the USS Mississippi with a flying boat and a single hydro aeroplane. Upon arrival, the aviators immediately began flying reconnaissance missions. On May 6, 1914, during an overland scouting mission, a Curtiss hydro airplane flown by Lieutenant Bellinger with Lieutenant Softly as observer was hit by rifle fire. This marks the first combat damage to a naval airplane. The Pensacola aviators continued flying missions until June 1914, when they were released to return to Pensacola to a hero's welcome. Upon their return, the naval aviators immediately resumed their flight training and also their various experiments. One of the most important was devising a method of successfully catapulting an airplane off a moving ship, something that had never been done. On April 16, 1915, Lieutenant Bellinger successfully launched from a stationary coal barge in Pensacola Bay. On November 5, 1915, Lieutenant Commander Mustin made the first catapult launch from a ship when he was shot from the stern of the USS North Carolina, which was moored. Finally, on July 12, 1916, the last milestone in the catapult test was passed. Lieutenant Chevalier was shot from the bow of the USS North Carolina while the ship was actually underway in Pensacola Bay. On May 8, 1915, a second naval aviator was killed in Pensacola. Lieutenant Stoltz died when the hydroplane in which he was making a flight took a sudden dive downward into the bay. The engine of the machine struck the aviator at the base of his skull, and this, it was stated, caused his death. When further deaths were attributed to the motor falling on top of the helpless aviators, the Pensacola Naval Aviators petitioned Washington to purchase tractor airplanes with the engine placed in front. After much hesitation, Washington finally agreed, but the first tractor airplane would not arrive in Pensacola until late 1960. As the number of flight students increased in Pensacola, so too did the number of fatal accidents, sometimes during training events, other times during record-setting flight attempts by the more experienced aviators. On June 9, 1916, while trying to break his hydroplane altitude record of 16,000 feet, Lieutenant Softly was killed when he stalled and spun to his death onto the sands of Santa Rosa Sound. Pensacola's cemeteries would soon be filled with the broken bodies of the little-known and world-famous naval aviators. From February 1914 to the end of World War I, 25 young men were killed in airplane accidents in Pensacola. The U.S. Navy was firmly committed to its seaplanes and hydro airplanes. There wasn't the slightest bit of interest in land planes, and the Secretary of the Navy was even quoted as saying that land utilization is not a function of the Navy. The Navy is an institution afloat and must leave land flying to other departments and agencies. But there was another new type of aviation that the U.S. Navy was definitely interested in: lighter than air. In June 1915, almost exactly 4 years after ordering its first airplanes, the U.S. Navy placed an order for a kite balloon, a free balloon, and a non-rigid airship. The logical place to base all of the Navy's lighter-than-air assets was Pensacola. Since open space was limited on the grounds of the old Pensacola Navy Yard, the first expansion beyond the brick walls occurred in April 1916, when the U.S. Navy ordered the residents of Woolsey to either move or demolish their homes. This is the north wall of the Pensacola Navy shipyard that originally demarcated U.S. Navy property from the village of Woolsey, which was north of the station. When balloons came to Pensacola, it marked the first expansion beyond these walls when the town of Woolsey was removed to make way for a balloon landing field. Eventually, 2 balloon hangars were built on the field. While awaiting the completion of the construction of the new balloon field and also the building of a hydrogen station, several launches of free balloons and kite balloons were made from the grounds of the air station. Some launches proved to be more exciting than others. On April 7, 1916, an unmanned kite balloon broke free from its moorings and, driven by a 30-mile-per-hour gale, was last seen heading in a northeasterly direction. It finally struck the top of a tall pine tree near the town of Argyle, which is about 84 miles from Pensacola. The residents, having read of the German Zeppelin attacks on London, were absolutely terrified, and they thought they were being attacked. Reports that they tore the balloon apart were unfounded. By early 1917, the balloon field was finished. The field was described as being perfectly level, with an airship mooring mast of about 100 feet in height centered in the middle of the field. A large balloon hangar had also been built at the field. The field's hard-packed clay provided a perfect landing surface for heavier-than-air aircraft. Visiting U.S. Army pilots would also use this field when visiting nearby Fort Barrancas. In December 1916, the DN-1, the U.S. Navy's first dirigible, non-rigid, arrived at Pensacola. Preceded by its floating hangar, she was described as having a coat of bright orange varnish and made her first test flight in April 1917. Regretfully, the airship suffered from poor design and too much weight, and after only a few more flights, she was deflated and eventually broken up. With no use for the floating hangar, it was assigned to shore duty and eventually rebuilt to shore at the balloon field. Other more successful ships, however, would follow in the DN-1's footsteps, and the Naval Airship School was soon established at Pensacola. The B-class dirigible arrived in August 1917 and proved to be a complete success with over 16 purchased. This was followed by the C-class, the D-class, and the single E-class airship, all stationed at Pensacola. In 1921, however, all lighter-than-air activities in the U.S. Navy were transferred to NAS Lakehurst, New Jersey, and the airship hangars at Pensacola were converted to other uses. A pioneering era in the history of naval aviation in Pensacola had ended.